So up next is Dr. Mary. She's got a variety of experiences. If I remember correctly, all the way from Carolinas out to Idaho, now back to Nebraska. That's kind of unique in itself. She specializes in cover crops and crop residues in beef cattle production systems here at the University of Nebraska. As I said earlier, she's been on the panels and been very instrumental in putting this program together. So without any further introduction, I'll turn it over to you.
So my job was really to talk about really the balance of timing of harvest. So there's a lot of things that we got to think through when we're thinking about when are we going to harvest small cereals, right? I know you all want to have high yield and high quality, right? You want your cake and you want to eat it too, but we can't have it all. So as we talk today, I'm going to talk through some of the things that we have to think through in terms of the balance between quality and yield when it comes to small cereals. And then you have to put it in context of the next thing, which is what's the next crop, right? Because harvest date not only affects the yield and the quality of the small grain silage that you're going to harvest, but it also affects, right, your potential planting date for your next crop and what the yield may look like for that particular crop. Okay, so before we get into the nitty-gritty, I want to make sure we're all on the same page when it comes to stages, because we're going to talk about stages today. As Darren kind of alluded to, if we think about the small cereals at a relative stage of maturity, a lot of differences tend to go away between species. So the first stage we're going to talk about is harvesting at boot. So in boot stage, what we have is basically no heads are out, but you can see the heads. They're just below the flag leaf here. So this is that top leaf of that plant. And then the seed head is just below it. So when I talk about boot stage, that's really what I'm talking about. The next one is pollination. And I think most of you can figure out pollination. That's a pretty easy one. All the heads are out. So we've gone past heading and we have that nice yellow pollen out there. So that's kind of the next stage that I'm going to discuss as we start walking through those stages. And this, for our winter hardy species, we often see, at least in eastern Nebraska, if we're planting mid-October to early November, we're going to see that about early June. And then the next stages we get to would be milk and soft dough. And for milk, basically now we're talking about taking that seed out of the head, squeezing it, and if you get a white milky substance out of it, that's milk stage, right? And if you look on here, I have early June as well. One of the key things about small cereals is, boy, they work through their stages very, very quickly. And I would say that's probably one of the #1 challenges with making small cereal silages. I have a few head nods in the crowd because everybody knows that's probably the biggest difficulty. Whatever you shoot for, you're probably going to hit the next stage because you might be 5 to 7 days between stages. Get one good rain and you're out of business. And then if the custom chopper can't get there, there's a whole nother scenario. So soft dough is the last one we're going to talk about. And soft dough, no longer do we have the milky substance, but we just have kind of a doughy substance that'll squeeze out of there. And of course, the next stage would be hard dough. And we're looking at mid to late June. So I want you to kind of have that in your head as we're thinking about stages and thinking about, well, if I harvested in early June, if I harvested in mid-June, what would I be planting and what would the impacts be? And so Darren alluded to planting dates in corn, right? And its effect on corn yield. So we have a few options, right? One would be pretty popular to follow small cereal with corn silage, right? And another one might be like sorghum silage. So I'm gonna put Matt's feet to the fire, and he's going to have to tell us what happens if I harvest in, let's say, mid-May versus, say, mid-June, and what I might expect in terms of what am I giving up on, say, something like sorghum silage. Because now we've got that balance here that we got to think about. What do I get out of the small grains, and what do I give up out of my next crop? So the first thing I really want to talk about is trying to answer two questions. So over the past couple of years, Darren and I and a slew of students, including Abigail, this is her project, have been trying to answer two questions. One is, what should I plant? So if I'm going to plant a winter hardy species, Should I plant rye? Should I plant triticale, or should I plant wheat? And the next one is, when's the best time to harvest, right? That's another typical question we might get. So we've been doing a little bit of work trying to look at the differences between the species and the stage of harvest and how that might impact the yield and quality. Okay, so let's talk about yield first. So what I have on here is I have those stages that we talked about. So boot, pollination, milk, and soft dough. We harvested rye, triticale, and wheat at the same stages. Now, I should point out, this is an average over 2 years. We didn't have any interactions between the years, so I put them together. The rye, however, was 2 different varieties. The first year we had Ryman rye, and the second year we had Elbon rye. The triticale was also 2 different varieties. The first year it was, I think it was 1140, and the second year it was 11406. So any of you know NT 11406 or NT 1140. For most of you, probably like, I have no clue what that means. That's me. And then wheat, it was Arapaho. So if any of you are just interested in what they were, that's what it is. So now we're looking at the dry matter tons in terms of yield across time. There's no huge surprises that as the small cereal grains mature, we get more yield, right? That's kind of a duh. What is a little bit interesting is how they kind of fall apart here at soft dough. So early on, we really don't see huge differences between the wheat, triticale, and rye. But at soft dough, we see that the wheat really kind of fell off. And some of you are probably looking at this and going, well, how does that happen biologically? One of the things that we noticed is that we got a lot of leaf senescence at soft dough. So we had leaves that we captured here on that wheat, but here we didn't capture them because they had browned off and fell off. So I think that's part of why we saw this drop off. And it was the same variety, of course, over both years. We also saw that particular variety of wheat's probably not the variety I would choose if I am going to choose wheat for silage, because the other thing we saw was a lot of lodging troubles with this particular wheat. So there are probably better wheats to be choosing. If we look at the difference between rye and triticale, we see, again, if we're hitting soft dough, remember this is that kind of late June period that we might get a little bit more yield out of triticale. But surprisingly to me anyways, we really did not see the rye and the triticale pull apart, which is I kind of expected. So we didn't see that until the very end. So that's maybe a little bit contrary to kind of common knowledge or common discussion. Okay, so now let's talk about energy content. Now, a couple of things I got to point out here, one of which is that this is post-fermentation TDNs. And I know some of you feedlot guys probably don't think in TDN, and all the cow-calf guys do. So sorry, I went with cow-calf. But it doesn't really matter because you can look at the relative changes to see what's going on here. So again, we kind of have that same setup, and I really just wanted to point out a couple things. One of which is we didn't see huge differences across the species. The triticale actually at the same relative stage kind of came out just a little bit lower than the wheat and the rye, at least early on and late. But remember, at late we got an additional, I don't know, what is this? This is almost 2 tons of yield over the rye and almost 4 over the wheat. So I might give up a little bit of concentration for a little bit of yield, depending on targets. However, if we look here, if you're looking for really high quality forage, you're going to have to go early, right? Because we're 55 to 60 TDNs at boot. We go down from there to milk. Anybody know why we're going up here? From milk to soft dough, why do we get a little bit more energy? Starch. Excellent. I didn't have to call on one of the students, so they thank you. Okay, so
Hey, Mary.
Yes, sir.
I got a question online. It says, because the species have different maturities, were all 3 products harvested differently to focus on the same maturity stage?
Indeed, and I'll show you the dates in just a few minutes, but that's exactly what we did, Dano. We actually harvest on different dates, so we tried to hit the same relative maturity. Now, my expectations about how those species would react and what happened are a little bit different. So I'll show you those. I think actually it might be not the next slide, but the next slide. There's some things here that I didn't expect. So if we look at the change here going from milk to soft dough, we get a little bit more starch, so we gain a little bit more energy. So really probably what this says is this is not a good time to harvest, right? Because I get less energy and I could wait a little bit longer and actually get more yield, right? We go back to here. I could get up a little bit higher yield, at least if it's not wheat, and have a little bit more energy. Okay, so we'll come back to that in a second. Let's look at crude protein. So crude protein probably does what you all expect as well, or at least what I would expect. Textbook, as it got more mature, we got lower protein. Now, couple key things here, one of which is these were fertilized with 40 pounds of nitrogen. And if we look at boot stage, we see we're somewhere in alfalfa territory, right? Very high protein for alfalfa, at least for beef cows. Maybe not dairy quality alfalfa there, Matt. But we're up there 18, 19% crude protein. This is actually fairly consistent. And if you go to the Southeast, we don't see those numbers. Like they can put on the same amount, 40 pounds in, have the same amount of residual in the soil, and we don't get nearly that high. Anybody got an idea what might be going on there? Why do we get so high? What's different between here and the Southeast? Soil types, growing degree days, and temperatures. So one of the things is this growing in much cooler temperatures for much longer, especially in the early spring. So it has more time to pull up in relative to the rate of growth that you're going to have early on. What we actually see, which is kind of interesting, this is just a dilution effect. We got more yield, we diluted out the crude protein. The total yield of protein is the same across all of this. It's almost like it doesn't pull up any more in during that whole growing period after we hit boot, which kind of interesting to me. We don't gain anything by going later in terms of crude protein, which I didn't expect. Looking at the relative comparison among the species, we really see, rye was just a little bit higher than the triticale and the wheat, but we don't see huge differences here among the species. And so depending on what your goal is, right, if I want to use it as a protein supplement, which a couple years ago, I had some guys who did that, right? They said, I can't get a hold of distillers. I'm just going to harvest my triticale. They had triticale. They said, I'm going to harvest it early, and I'm going to use it as my protein source. That can work, especially for cow systems. That's actually a really nice little system there. Or you can go higher yield, and you're going to recognize that you're going to have much lower protein contents, but might still fit for a cow diet, right? Might feed more of it and works fairly well. And looking at this energy, that'd be okay for a winter cow diet, right? All right, so this is the question about timing of harvest. So I have both years up here. Remember in the first year, this is 2020, by the way. This is spring of 2020 is year one. Spring of 2021 is year two. And this rye, that's Ryman, and this is Elbon. Okay, so the first thing that caught my eye, what I did not expect, is we went out and we would be staging every couple days and look at the date we harvested the rye and the date we harvested triticale for boot, same day. Start going down the line there and you realize we really harvested them basically on the same day the whole time for that first year, which is not what I expected. Now this is probably to do with the varieties we actually selected, and so that's another lesson I think is really important. There's probably just as much variation in variety as there is among species. Darren, would you agree?
100% agree.
Darren puts his thumbs up and says 100% agree. So I got the agronomist, the expert's opinion, and he agrees with me. Okay, so a couple other things that's interesting. So first year, we really didn't harvest different dates for rye and triticale. Wheat was behind by about 5 to 7 days in the first year. And then as it went through the stages, it actually got ahead. Same thing happened in year two. It started out behind and it got ahead. So we actually had a more collapsed season in terms of harvest. So if you're looking for a window to harvest, This one's going to be a little bit shorter for wheat than it was for the rye and the triticale. Year 2 with Elbon rye, it did what I expected it to do. I expected us to be harvesting earlier for the rye. And indeed, we were about 5-6 days ahead of triticale early on. And we maintained that increase in the date that we would actually be harvesting for the rye all the way through in year 2. That's what I expected. And I actually think that's one of the reasons why we often see people think rye is lower quality. It's because in the same relative date, you'd be harvesting something that's more mature. If you harvest at the same stage, we don't see huge differences between these, which is kind of interesting. The other thing that I noticed was in that first year, I started looking around and looking at ours and looking at all the cereal rye that's planted out in fields as cover crops. And I was like, gosh, it's so far ahead of ours. And one of the things that was interesting, we had an unfertilized triticale, which we're not showing the data for, but we had an unfertilized triticale in these particular plots. And it did seem to be a little bit more rapid through its maturity stages than the fertilized. So interestingly, it actually headed out a little bit earlier, which I think is kind of makes me think that we maybe have an observation that rye is really early, and it's because we see so much rye that is unfertilized, right? Because a lot of people use it as cover crop. Okay, so this is just a picture to illustrate the difference between varieties under the same conditions. And I say varieties very loosely here, right? The one picture, this on this side is Elbon, on this side, right, is a variety non-stated. I don't know what it is. In Nebraska, we tend to get mostly northern ryes for variety non-stated, and this Elbon would be a southern type rye. And you can see the difference early in the spring. This is April 8th down in Fall City. So where's Gary? Gary was involved in this one, and this is in the same field, so it's all under the same conditions, same planting date. I should point out the planting date was really early. I think it was like mid-September. It was on some prevent plant acres. So it's kind of best case scenario. I wouldn't expect you to get this much yield that early most of the time. But I really wanted to point out, if you look at the two, this Elbon actually is fully headed. It's kind of hard to see on this, but it's actually fully headed, whereas the variety non-stated is still in the boot stage. So even though they're both rye, we do see huge differences among varieties. And of course, because they were in different maturities, we saw different yields. I mean, that seems reasonable, right? My point is, not all rye is the same, not all triticale is the same, not all wheat's the same. And so I think there's a lot to say for selecting varieties to fit your situation. All right, so my conclusion, at least about species, is rye or triticale seem to, in this case, the ones we use, they really did seem to do a little bit better than our wheat did, and they'd probably be the best ones on a nutrient yield per acre. And we'll look at the question about staging here in a second.
Mary? Well,
yes, sir.
On the species question, we've got a question here from Argentina that in their conditions, barley seems to have the best combination of yield and quality. Any comments on that?
Yeah, so the question about barley doing better in Argentina, that makes a lot of sense to me because they're a lot warmer than we are throughout their season. They can have oats growing most of the winter and graze it. We don't seem to do as well with barley. We don't really have good winter varieties of barley that will overwinter. So for us, barley is only a winter sensitive species, not winter hardy. So that's kind of why we don't even have barley in this mix, because we couldn't plant it in the fall and then use it in the spring. Now, that does bring up a question, because we haven't really talked about, well, what if I just want to plant in the spring? The reason I don't bring it up is really if I'm trying to fit it into a double cropping system, especially if I'm going to double crop it with another cash crop or even a silage crop, you're already, again, delaying those stages even further. So, what do you think it is, Darren? The difference between winter hardy and winter sensitive and timing of harvest, is it a month different?
That's pretty close.
Okay, Darren says it's pretty close. He wasn't quite as sure about that one. He's not going to contradict me, but He's going to say, nah, maybe. So that's one of the downsides, I would say, to the winter sensitive is just that you have to wait to plant them, and then you have to wait for them to grow. You're giving everything a heads up, a little ability to put some roots in the ground by planting them in the fall. By the way, one of the most amazing things that I saw was, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I went out with an extension educator, and they were taking some soil samples, and they had planted rye after soybeans, and they were planted on 15-inch rows, which is kind of cool because they went through and they put a deep probe in right through the middle of the rye, and they pulled it up, and we looked for live roots. Went down, how would you guess? 3-inch tall rye. How far did the roots go? A foot. Higher or lower? Higher? How much higher? 16. Higher or lower? Everybody good? All right, 16 inches. Try 30. That's pretty amazing. Then we went in between the rows because I was like, well, that's just that, straight down. In between the rows, it was still 20. Pretty impressive. So my point is that there's a lot going on underground that you're not seeing, right, with those fall planted. So they really do have quite a leg up on the winter sensitive. Yes, sir.
Mary, that picture. Sorry I lost my voice, but that picture you showed, we sampled that like a week later. Roots were actually down almost 7 feet.
Holy smokes. How in the world did you get down 7 feet? Backhoe? Oh, all right. So Gary said, so I was trying to remember when we sampled that. It was in March. We sampled that in March. And then he said a week later, they sampled it again, and it was down 7 feet. That's pretty impressive. Okay, so back to on topic. Sorry, little rabbit trail there. If we look at just taking those species and combining them, because I really wanted to get you guys in your head the change in quality and then the change in yields. Basically, what we see here is that if we look at the TDN, right, this is that same pattern we saw before, where we're looking at somewhere around 55 to 60% TDN for boot stage, so very high quality. We don't lose a whole lot going down to pollination. Now we're down to 55 plus or minus. But going down to milk, now we've lost a good 10, 15 units, right? So either you're going to want to harvest up in here, or you're going to want to harvest here and probably not here. In terms of protein, you see that linear decline. So, the question is, are you okay with 10% crude protein? Do you need higher protein? If you do, you're going to harvest earlier, and that's going to have to be a decision. Now, if you want to look at it as nutrient yield per acre, right? So especially if you're thinking about a feedlot and you have, well, if I use it in a growing ration, I'm going to probably want a little higher quality. If I'm just going to use it as roughage in a finishing ration, then I want the highest yield. Those are two different questions, right? By the way, we did a survey of producers that were making small cereals, and one of the questions we asked them is, why did they choose the harvest time they chose? And almost all of them said a balance between quality and yield, right? But yet we had a variety of harvest timings from boot all the way to soft dough, right? Because it's all about what are your goals and which one did you decide to put more of a priority on, right? It's all a balance. It's just which ones did they prioritize. So if we look here, this is TDN yield, and you see you get a linear increases as you get it more mature. That does make sense to me, even with that drop in energy at milk, because you had higher yield, it still gets more yield per acre. And if we go all the way up to soft dough, we can be, 7,000 pounds of TDN per acre. That's pretty good, right? But we're going from mid-May harvest to mid-June harvest, right? So in between there, you've got a month. Okay, so for higher quality forage, we usually suggest, if you read the literature, it talks about boot stage, and I would say if you want really high quality forage, boot stage it is. But we don't give up as much as I would have thought anyways, going to pollination or somewhere in between, right? Because heading happens in between boot and pollination to get a little bit more yield without sacrificing a huge amount of nutritive value. So I think there's there is some balance there that's worth considering. In terms of maximizing TDN yield, soft dough is a great target. What's the challenge with soft dough? Low quality. Okay, so yeah, it is a little bit lower quality, right? You get 50 TDN, which isn't really high energy, right? The other is that if you miss it, you get the hard dough, right? And then you just have straw and some seed, and you don't have enough moisture to actually ensile something. And we see that happen quite a bit. And I was talking about the difference in stages. We're going 5 to 7 days. It's easy to miss. So that's always a challenge. So if you are shooting for soft dough, when it hits milk, you want to be ready to harvest, right? So maybe you should have in your mind you're shooting for milk and you'll hit soft dough. Yes, sir.
We got a question here, and I'm going to show my ignorance here, but it says, what impact have you observed from OWNS, OWNS?
Yeah, OWNS.
And okay,
A?
good. In silage from later harvested rye or triticale, any difference in the effect between silage and baleage?
Ooh, okay. So the question is about OWNS and whether or not we have trouble with them in silage versus baleage. Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so number one, there's another reason why everybody thinks rye is low quality. If you bale-headed rye, you have an OWN problem, right? And I'm talking about dry hay here. The nice thing about silage is that you have the moisture, which helps keep them softer, and we don't have the problem. So now the question is baleage, which is kind of in between. A lot of people actually harvest baleage fairly dry. There's a lot of baleage that goes up 50% dry matter, 50% moisture. And so I understand why they're asking about it, and I have no clue the answer. I do not know. I would guess that it's still probably softer than hay, but I don't know if we would start seeing some mouth sores or some palatability issues, because is it dry enough to cause it to be stiff enough to be a problem? Does anybody have any experience with it here? Okay, so Sarah says that she's had producers say that they've had some troubles and then they've also not had troubles, and their big take home was it's all about the moisture. So I think just like with silage, I don't think it matters that the chopping so much. I do think it's about the moisture and keeping those on soft. So if you're going to do it, harvest it at a little bit higher moisture content. Don't skirt the edge on baleage, because a lot of people do really go kind of dry on baleage, unfortunately. So a great question. Okay, so I'm going to talk about one other thing here, and that is a little bit of data that we have from sampling some small grain silage from producers over the last year. We had about 17 producers and about 20 different harvests, where we were actually looking at taking samples at harvest and taking samples after fermentation, and we were looking at, what kind of quality were they getting, what kind of impacts were they getting in terms of the feeding value. And there's a couple take-home messages I thought were really interesting. This particular project could not happen without cooperation from a lot of our extension educators, both beef and crops, because that's a lot of work to go out and get all those samples. And the student who's in charge of that is Alexa Johnson. She's out at US Mark, and she coordinated all of this on top of her full-time job. So I really appreciate that. All right, so if we think about the stage at harvest and the dry matter content, I expected, based off of my observations, that I wasn't going to see too much wet silage at soft dough. I like to show all my ignorance, so I tell you all the things I expect and then how I'm wrong. I'm just keeping it real, okay? So what we saw here is that regardless of stage, we did see a lot of very wet silage being put up. And it's not because of a wilt versus non-wilt situation. We actually, the majority of them said they wilted. It's hard to see on here, but these two were not wilted and this one was not wilted. The rest were wilted. However, time of wilting differs, right? And so one of the things that we did notice was For these stages, if they said they wilted 12 to 16 hours, those were the guys who kind of hit in this green range, which is our target, 30 to 35, right? And for a soft dough, it looked like they had to be about 2 hours or so. Now, you can see, you can also get too dry, which is a problem. And Dr. Kung is going to be talking about inoculants, and that's one of the things that I was really interested in is using an inoculant, especially if you do have a tendency to maybe have your silage put up a little bit too wet. What benefits can an inoculant have? So I wanted to show you this. So we took pre and post, basically fermentation samples. And just to set this up, this is basically across the samples here. So this is just the number for the sample. We just identified them individually. And then the pre-harvest or the at-harvest sample is the gray. So basically, this is the potential energy you could have captured, right? That's how much TDN you had at harvest. And then the post is basically after fermentation, how much did they actually capture? So you can look at the difference here, or this gray bar is how much energy they lost during the fermentation process. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so on average, across all these samples, they lost about 7 TDN units. Some, like look at this one. This one went from basically about 57 down to 40. 17 TDN units. That's basically losing the majority of your feed value right there. So I have some stars. And you look here, there's stars on here, and most of them are red. The reason they're red is these are the samples that were way too wet, and the red ones had butyric acid production. So that says that they had clostridial fermentation, which you're going to learn a lot more about today. But basically, that's the problem with putting it up too wet, is that you have the wrong type of fermentation, and that type of fermentation means that you're going to lose a lot of energy. So if you start looking at these, you start seeing a whole lot bigger gray bars when they had the butyric acid or the clostridial fermentation. So that's the problem with putting it up too wet. And this is just another way to look at it. So basically, I just took the dry matter here at packing and basically plotted it against the TDN loss. And all these in the red here were the ones that had clostridial fermentation. And you can see the shift in the amount of loss they had, right? So they lost more energy during fermentation because they were put up too wet, and they got clostridial bacteria that were doing most of the fermentation for you. Well, not most, but some of the fermentation for you. So this is what we want to avoid. And this was a very common problem. So I think one of the key challenges here is making sure that we are wilting small cereals enough to get that moisture into the proper range. One other thing, there was a question about pricing small cereals in the field. In particular, if you got a neighbor who has some cover crop and you're thinking, that looks like forage to me, and you're trying to figure out how much is it worth. We do have a little spreadsheet that can help you price it relative to corn silage or relative to hay. I actually played with it the other day because I was kind of curious. With corn right now being so expensive, boy, that forage can be worth quite a bit. Looking at the drought, I kind of wonder how much that's inflated. So I did it relative to hay prices and relative to corn silage, and I think looking at both and then thinking about which one you want to compare it to makes sense. But if you're interested, it's a handy little tool. It's not a decision maker or anything, but it does give you some ideas and some things that you can take to your neighbor and talk through. All right, with that, I'll take any more questions that we may have. All right, Dan?
Any experience in the combination of cereals and vetch for silage?
Oh, good question. Okay, so the question is basically about using vetch in with the cereals for silage. So we got a couple things going on there. One of which is, there isn't a lot of legumes that we can put in with winter hardy species that'll overwinter, and hairy vetch is one of them, right? So there's a lot of interest in adding that legume. There's some challenges. Actually, we've tried some of it, and a lot of times we have a hard time getting the vetch to compete. especially for silage. The other challenge is that, unfortunately, depending on the maturity of vetch, you can have a toxin in vetch that can cause certain genetics of animals to become photosensitive. And it really depends a lot. Like, it seems to be that some cattle will respond and some cattle won't. It seems to differ. Like, I know a producer who used hairy vetch for years, had no problems, and then one year, boom, he had half of his herd actually get photosensitive, and he had to put them down. So I'm not trying to scare you, but there is a risk with vetch. So I think the earlier harvests, I don't worry nearly as much about because it doesn't get mature and we don't get that. And seed tends to be the one that has the highest concentration. So if you get it to let it go to seed, that's really probably where you have the most problem. But we haven't done a lot of work with it, mostly because we get a little nervous about using vetch. The other thing is that typically with annuals and short growing seasons, we don't get the nitrogen in terms of the response for that crop. And so we get nitrogen in terms of the feed for the animal, but not in terms of actually getting growth. So then we want to add the nitrogen when nitrogen was cheap. Nitrogen's not cheap anymore, so maybe the decision's different now. So I don't know the answer, but we haven't done a whole lot with it.
3 questions now.
3 questions.
One is for, well, a couple of them are quick. One is for the conversation earlier in the room. Was the spelt spring or winter planted? Is that what, yeah, spring or winter planted? The other question, I'll just throw them all out there. The other question is your survey published? And then the last one is, when chopping rye silage, what's the best way to determine moisture?
Okay, so the first one about spelt, you want to answer that one? Spring. Spring planted and harvested in September. That's what I heard, right? All right, at least in Montana. All right, the next question was the survey published? And it is not published. We actually, we still have a couple more samples to collect because they haven't completely opened, so all of their silos yet. And the third question was about how do we monitor moisture in our crops? And that is the hard one, right? That's probably the biggest challenge. And actually, I think the next thing we're going to tackle is trying to find a quick way. Because I'm sure most of you know ways to look at moisture, right? Microwave testing, right? That's probably pretty common. Coster tester, that's what we use, is a Coster tester. Just chop up the silage. But then it's 30 minutes later before you know the answer with a Coster tester, which is a little bit unfortunate. Do what? Air fryer, yep, or a dehydrator is another option. Yes, sir.
An NIR cup sitting in the next room that everybody can take a look at. Do that in 30 seconds.
So you just said there's an NIR cup. Is that what you said? That'll do it in 30 seconds. That's actually, I was going to say NIR is the thing I think has the opportunity for us. How much does it cost, John?
This one's from Consumer Physics style cup they developed for forage. I don't know off the top of my head. Somewhere around $3,000 to $3,500 for 3 years all in last time I heard, but I don't know.
Okay, 3 to 3,500.
Yeah, the company, 1,500 for the cup and 1,200 for
And $1,200 for the annual subscription, which is basically to update the regressions. That's actually what I was interested in. There's some guns on the market and things like that that are NIR that might be possibilities to get instantaneous. There's always some challenges, but I would say really is worth the time to figure out, are we near the right moisture? And I would say that most people probably are trying to eyeball it and they're thinking it's much drier than it is. At least that's what that data suggests, right? Because most of them said, squeeze test, right? They tried squeeze test. Problem is you usually don't have it chopped because you're wilting it. It's not chopped up. So the squeeze test does not really work very well on small grains. And I think you underestimate the amount of moisture because of that, because you don't have all those cut edges. So that's that's my spiel on it. Is I don't have a great answer. There's a lot of options, and some people like one option over another. I do kind of like your option. The dehydrator or air fryers are fairly quick. Just don't use your wife's. Just saying, buy your own. So basically, you're asking about soil moisture, and if I let it go later, does that have more of a negative effect on soil moisture? That's your question. And I don't know of any data, but logically it makes sense that as it continues to grow, you are using more soil moisture. And there's actually, I mean, in the cover crop world, right? That's one of the things that they talk about a lot, especially in the drier climates. So the further west we go, they talk a lot about, killing it early so we don't use as much soil moisture. So yes, I think the answer is the later you go, likely the more soil moisture you are using. All right, I think I'll be around too. We can have more discussions. I really appreciate the interaction, but I think we'll keep moving to stay on target.
Sure. Mary, a hand, please. Thank you.